19 days ago, I dipped my toes into the world of sourdough bread. I started by following a recipe that called for me to mix all-purpose unbleached flour with some whole wheat flour in order to strengthen the microbiome of my starter. This is the brand that I chose. I started by mixing together a 1-to-3 ratio of white unbleached all-purpose flour and whole wheat flour. So that totaled out to 9 cups of unbleached all-purpose flour and 3 cups of whole wheat flour, and I kept that in an airtight container for future feedings. Here you can see me starting my sourdough starter with 1 cup of that flour mixture that I mentioned before and 1 cup of spring water. I can try and link a few of the recipes that I referenced down below for you guys if you would like to try to make sourdough starter from scratch as well. But as you'll see later in the video, I did kind of mix up my recipes a little bit, and that did result in a little bit of a slow start for my sourdough starter. Although my starter is almost 3 weeks old at this point, I had just now baked my first loaf of sourdough bread, and I will show you guys that loaf later in the video. Here is me mixing together my sourdough starter with the wrong tool. You can see we were off to a great start. But eventually I got everything combined and it sat on the counter for full 24 hours just like this. And I know I put a solid top on it after this. I didn't know better at the time. Then per the recipe that I was referencing, I only mixed it on day 2 and didn't feed it. And then on day 3 was the very first feeding. Here's what it looked like on day 2 after a good stirring. And as you're about to see, there's really not much activity in the next couple of days with this. On day 3, I did have a little bit of a false rise, and I'll show you that here in just a few seconds. But after that false rise, it actually didn't do anything for about a week. This was my starter right before a feed, and it was definitely bubbly and had some activity, and it definitely smelled like alcohol, but it wasn't doing much else. Here is day 3's false rise, and as you can see, it has doubled from the last feed, but it didn't do much after this day. Between days 3 and 4 is when I lost the recipe that I was using initially, and so I had to Google it again and find a different one, and that's the reason for the slow start on my sourdough starter, because I was not using the same recipe as before. But finally, after getting my ratios correct, I finally had a doubled sourdough starter. By week 2, I had a fully established sourdough starter that doubled consistently every single day. And now that my starter was older than 10 days old and had consistently doubled every day for 3 days in a row, it was time to bake. Okay, I have water in this bowl. I have 250 grams of water. Now I'm gonna do, I think 150 grams of starter and 25 grams of olive oil, and then mix that together, and then I'm gonna do salt and flour. Okay, now I've added 10 grams of fine sea salt and 500 grams of bread flour to my mixture, my liquid mixture, and now I'm going to knead it with my hands until it comes together kind of like clumpy, and then I'm gonna let it sit for 30 minutes to an hour and do what's called like an auto-lyse, I think is how it's pronounced, where basically like the flour will have time to absorb all of the wet ingredients, and then I'll be able to do the stretch and folds with the dough. In the meantime, Alora's having breakfast, and while it sits for the 30 minutes to an hour, I'm gonna go get coffee, and then I'm gonna come back and check on it. Now, I will say I was following a recipe here, but I think I combined the ingredients in the wrong order, and I think that creates a little bit of trouble later on. Okay, I'm back home. It's been an hour, and here's what my dough is looking like. Looks kind of the same, maybe a little bit, risen a little bit. So now I'm gonna start the bulk fermentation process where I let it rise for anywhere between 3 to 12 hours, depending on the temperature. I think what I'm gonna do to kind of speed the process up a little bit is put it in the oven with the oven light on only, so that the oven is just a little bit warmer. And I'm going to lightly oil this cling wrap right here and then kind of shape the dough a little bit and then put it back in here with the oiled cling wrap and then put that in the oven and go ahead and set a timer. And I think I'm gonna let Alora nap and then I'll check on it. I'm really wanting to do the series of stretch and folds like 30 minutes into the bulk fermentation process, but if she starts to nap on me, then that's really gonna affect when I can do the stretch and folds. So I don't know, we'll see. I'm kind of just playing it by ear. I kind of just want to watch the dough and not the clock and just see kind of what it needs. This is my first dough though, or my first loaf. So I'm kind of just going off of some tutorials and videos that I've read and watched. So I really hope it comes out good. I'm really nervous that it's going to come out and not be good. But of course it is my first loaf, so if it does, no biggie. But yeah, that's the plan for right now. And I'm going to go ahead and oil up this cling wrap and shape the dough a little bit and set a timer. Now my cling wrap is lightly oiled. I'm going to mess with my dough a little bit and probably just shape it. Okay, here's what my dough is looking like. It's looking pretty good. I'm just going to kind of pinch and I guess create a little bit of tension. And then put that back in the bowl to begin the bulk fermentation process. Cling wrap, lightly oiled. Okay, I think we are all ready to go in the oven with the oven light on only. I'll be back. Okay, so I'm back home now. My dough has been autolyzing, or however you say that, for an hour. And I just did the first set of stretch and folds. So here is what my dough is looking like now. I did the stretch and folds with wet hands, so I just filled this bowl up with water and I dipped my hands in the water to wet them before I did each stretch and fold. And I will say it seems like that has allowed my dough to kind of smoothen out and like incorporate all of the dry bits that were on the outside before. It definitely is starting to look more and more like a ball of dough. So my sourdough starter, however, is very thick. Because last night I fed it at a 1:3:3 ratio so that it would rise later in the day and be ready to use later in the day, as opposed to when I was feeding it a 1:1:1 ratio, it would be ready at like 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and that's just too early for me to start making bread. So I decided to up the ratio of the feed and kind of give myself a little bit more time so that the sourdough starter would be at a peak around like 11 or 12-ish maybe, which is when I started making the dough this morning. So I'm hoping that I used the sourdough starter at the correct time, but it was still very thick. And so because of that consistency, my dough is very dense right now. And so I think the recipe that I am using said to do a series of 4 stretch and folds from anywhere between 15 minutes to an hour apart. But because my dough is so thick and is so dense and firm, I think I'm gonna give it a longer time in between the stretch and folds to really like ferment and like even out and really rise and just get a little bit looser. So I think I'm gonna go with an hour between each stretch and fold. However, Elora is gonna want to nap soon, so that means I may only be able to do 2 or 3 stretch and folds before she falls asleep on me, and then I'm gonna be nap trapped. So we will see. I'm gonna go ahead and set a timer for an hour and let this dough really sit and try to loosen up a little bit before I attempt to do any more stretch and folds on it, because it is just too structured and firm and dense right now. It's like, it's not loose at all. It's really hard to stretch. So I'm just gonna let it incorporate and even out and really start to rise and become looser so that the stretch and folds are easier to do. And I don't want to make the bread too tough either, so I'm just gonna let it sit for about an hour in the oven with the oven light on only, and just see what it does in that hour. It did seem to have risen just a little bit and incorporated the flour into the wet ingredients a little bit. So I'm really excited to see what it does, especially now that I've moistened it up a little bit with the stretch and folds with wet hands. So I think I have high hopes for it. I'm really hoping that it will start to look more like a dough loaf, like a loaf of bread, and be much easier to do the stretch and folds in the next hour. But we will see, and I will come back and show you what it looks like. Okay, I've just done my second set of stretch and folds on this dough, and I've covered it again with the oiled cling wrap. I will say it didn't seem like it had risen much. It definitely still is very dense and not stretchy at all. So I'm just gonna let it sit another hour or so. I think Alora's gonna nap like pretty soon. So I'm just gonna see what it does. And if it takes longer, then it takes longer to bulk ferment. So if the bulk fermentation process takes longer than expected, that's totally fine. I've got pretty much all day. So I guess I'm just gonna see what it does, and I don't want to manipulate it too much, so maybe I'll wait longer than an hour for the next round of stretch and folds, because it doesn't seem like this is really doing anything for the bread. So I guess we'll see. Okay, Alora just got up from a 2-hour nap, so I missed the third stretch and fold, which would have been in an hour. But that's okay, because my dough was still really stiff and firm and not stretchy at all. But now that it's been sitting in the oven with the oven light on only for the duration of Alora's nap, it has expanded and it looks a lot looser. So I'm hoping now that the next set of stretch and folds will be easier to do, because it does look a lot looser now than it was before. It was definitely too dense and too tight to do stretch and folds before. So I'm going to do the third set of stretch and folds, and hopefully it continues to ferment and have a much looser consistency for the rest of the bulk fermentation process, so that the bread comes out nice and fluffy. Okay, third round of stretch and folds, and going back in the oven with the light on for probably another hour or so, maybe. Okay. So last night I shaped my dough at like 10 o'clock at night, and it was definitely too late to put a loaf in the oven. So I went ahead and I put it in this banneton basket covered by some cling wrap. And I will say I definitely made a mistake because I didn't flour the banneton basket. So it's definitely gonna stick, and that's okay. But I think what I'm gonna do now is take it out and see if it needs shaped, put it in my Dutch oven here, and then go ahead and bake it and just see how it does, because I don't have high hopes for it, considering that it's been in the fridge overnight, and now it's 1 o'clock now, so it's been like 24 hours since I started this dough. But it's been in the fridge overnight. It's not been like in the oven or on the counter or anything like that, so I'm hoping it's not overproofed. But let's just bake it, and I guess we'll find out. Okay. So when I touch it, it does spring right back up, so I think it's okay. And it did come right out of there, it didn't stick. Here's what my dough is looking like. I think I'm just gonna, it doesn't look like it needs shaping at all. It's springing right back up. It's very flat though. So I think it's gonna be like really thin and dense, probably. I don't know, we'll see. I'm gonna dust it with some flour and score it, and I'm gonna go ahead and preheat my oven. don't think I need to use both this and the parchment paper, but I really just don't want it to burn on the bottom. So I'm just gonna do that. Okay. Ready to go in the oven. In the meantime, while my sourdough loaf was baking, I decided to make use of this absolutely gorgeous wedding anniversary gift that Elijah got me. Since I've been baking more often, he decided to go ahead and get me a KitchenAid mixer, which has made baking extraordinarily easier. I decided that the first thing that I was going to make in this gorgeous KitchenAid was a pumpkin loaf, and I'm really excited that I did because it was absolutely delicious, and Elijah's going to have a sweet treat to take with him to the golf course tomorrow. My bread is officially done. I have taken a peek at it and it does look pretty. So I'm really excited. I'm gonna go ahead and take it out and I'm gonna put it on this cooling rack for a couple hours before I slice into it. Okay, here it is. ever loaf of sourdough. I have to say, I think it looks very pretty for my first loaf. It's like a good shape, it expanded. I kind of messed up the little design here. It's got a good crust. I don't think I went deep enough on the little score there either, but it looks pretty. I'm really proud of myself. Okay, it's been maybe 3 hours or so since this came out of the oven. I just washed my hands and we're gonna do the very first slice of this to see what the crumb is like. Okay, so here's what it's looking like. Here's what it sounds like. I'm gonna go ahead and do a slice right down the middle. Okay. Here is what my first loaf of sourdough is looking like. Here we go. It definitely smells like sourdough, but it smells like, I don't know, more sour than traditional sourdough that you would buy at the store. I definitely think it could have risen a little bit more. I think I could work on my crumb a little bit. But, I mean, it feels very, like, wet and spongy. I think maybe it's, like, underdone a little bit. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. It has a very tight crumb and just little air bubble pockets. So, yeah, I definitely feel like I could work on that a little bit. But I am actually really impressed with myself that it came out relatively good for my first loaf. I'm really excited to keep working on it and perfect my technique, but I'm really proud of myself for this. While I was waiting for my bread to finish, I went ahead and made some pumpkin bread loaves too. So I'm gonna take those out and try these too. This one stuck to the bottom, unfortunately. It tastes amazing though. I also sprinkled a little bit of cinnamon sugar on top of these loaves, and I'm really excited to see how that tastes. Well, these are just falling apart, but the cinnamon sugar on top is so good. It's like the perfect final touch to the bread, and the first thing that I've made in my new KitchenAid mixer. I'm really excited.